the products that are going to be most transformative over the next few years are products that can not only sort of optimize everyone's calendars and the way that they're spending each minute of the day, but can unlock the potential in some of these groups that have previously maybe not been those top performers or previously not been able to rise above a certain threshold, whether that's sales or any other function. There's a lot of interesting things happening in coaching. There's a lot of leadership development principles here that can be applied at scale with some of the AI tools that now exist.
Hi, I'm Boaz, founder and CEO of Simply Augmented, and I'm excited that you are tuning in to Shift, a show that explores what it takes to thrive and adapt to the changing workplace in the digital age. In today's episode, I am thrilled to have Martina Welkhoff as our guest. Martina is the founder of WXR Fund and Goldenrod Ventures, and has always had a passion for supporting female founders and being a trusted advisor and mentor. During our conversation with Martina, we dive deep into her background and experience in the startup world as a former CEO in the VR space and investor. She shares insights on what it takes to run successful startups and how to navigate the challenges that come with it. We also talk about her new investment fund and explore some of the things she is excited about, along with technologies focused on the future of work. If you're an entrepreneur or someone interested in how new technologies are shaping the future of work, you won't want to miss this episode. All right. Martina, thank you for being on the podcast. I'm really, really excited to talk with you. And it's been a long time since we've been able to catch up. And so this will be a fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So I want to start by doing what I always do, which is I read to my guests their experience. And if I get anything wrong, you can push back on me and let me know if I got it wrong. So I'm going to start a little while back. And it looks like as a CEO and a co-founder, you were part of a company called Zealist, which I understand was around gaming and company culture.
Mhm.
And so you were there from December 2010 to around 2016. And then you were the founder of Convene VR,
Mhm.
2018 timeframe. And then from there, and when I first met you, you were an advisor to the venture reality fund, the VR fund, and then also founding partner at the WXR fund. Since then, you've been an advisory board member at Find Ventures. And we had talked to Elizabeth Scallon before on this show and
Mhm.
talked about Find Ventures. So I'm excited to talk to you about that. And more recently, you're the founding partner of Goldenrod Ventures. I also wanted to say, too, it sounds like you do a lot of work at the University of Washington Foster School of Business and an advisor there as well. So did I miss anything? And did I get that kind of right?
You nailed it. That was great. I mean, I've done little things here and there along the way, but those are the big ones.
Nice, nice. This show is about the future of work and about understanding the future of work in lots of different ways. Everything from communication and collaboration, post-pandemic versus before the pandemic, and then understanding also how our lives have changed working remotely with all these new tools that are coming at us. And so there's a lot to talk about. And I know you, as an investor, you've seen a lot of things. But because this is a kind of a future of work show, I always like to ask, what was your first job? Your first job when you actually got paid?
So it was not very glamorous at all. I was actually filing old medical records in a storage container for my dad was a doctor and they had all of this backlog of the archives and needed someone to basically spend a summer in a storage container putting it all together. And I did
Yeah.
get paid for that. I learned some things about resilience, but it was definitely not a very glamorous way to spend a summer when I was about 14.
But head down trying to organize. How about your favorite job? Could be your job now, but as you think back, what was your favorite?
Yeah, so I actually would say it's my job now, but just for fun, I'm going to go further back to prior to the bio you read, some of my early jobs. My favorite job from the early days was being a barista, actually. I was a
Ah,
barista at a cafe in Boston, and I absolutely loved the sense of community. I got to know a lot of the customers. It was very fast paced, it was a very busy place. And I just enjoyed kind of the social aspect of it and constantly getting to interact with folks all day and make them happy by making a perfect latte. So that was an early job that I found very gratifying and fun.
it sounds like a fun job being a barista.
It was fun. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Good life skill too,
And
vegan
good life
latte.
skills, yeah. I mean, do you think it had something to do, later on as you were thinking about culture and company culture and obviously a CEO of a company?
Yeah, I do think there were some good lessons early on. There were just, 3 or 4 of us there. I had one manager in particular who was really great and modeled a lot of sort of what I started to think about as early leadership attributes and how he treated employees and customers and how he ran the ship. I do think some of it translated, and it's also interesting thinking about the current state of work. And I know we're going to get into this with the hybrid nature of things, but obviously that was a very tangible, in person, physical job.
Yeah.
And I think I learned some fundamentals that translate to a virtual environment. And
Mm,
that's where I've spent a lot of time thinking over the last few years is how can we take some of these best practices from the real world and translate it into something meaningful in a digital realm? And
yeah.
so I think the seeds for that were planted there.
How about it with your family? What kind of jobs did your parents have? What was it? Was business a part of the discussion? Did you guys talk about it at the dinner table? And was it a big part of your childhood?
So, not really, actually. I come from a very medically oriented family. My dad was an orthopedic surgeon and my mom was a nurse. So, we mostly talked about patient cases and the newest innovation in surgery and that sort of thing. However, these kind of things always make sense in hindsight, but I was always the kid like starting a lemonade stand or selling crafts around the neighborhood. I was always kind of
Yeah.
trying to make a buck and and my parents definitely encouraged that tendency, that sort of entrepreneurial spirit. So while it wasn't a central tenet of their careers or our dinner table conversation, I do think that mentality and ethos was definitely fostered in me as a young child.
So you've been an entrepreneur for a long time.
I didn't know it. I didn't recognize it sort of, but yes, I absolutely now in retrospect see the tendencies.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how that's translated over time. When I first met you, it was the University of Washington, I think,
Mhm,
and you were investing in female founders. You were investing in VR and AR companies.
mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that and about how you've supported founders over the years? And
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned when you talked about my earlier work, I very much came into investing from the founder background and perspective. So, a lot of my work as a founder of Zealist and then Convene VR was in parallel with work I was doing around gender equity in tech and trying to support my peers, other women who were founding companies, as well as start to drill into some of the systemic issues and better understand why that vast gender disparity exists. And then my eyes were open to many other kinds of social disparity as well. And so when I switched to the funding side of the equation, I think first and foremost, I try to be the kind of investor I would have wanted as a CEO. And I really try to cultivate that empathy, especially now that I'm a few more years out from running my own company, but trying to remember what it's like in the CEO's shoes and really think about where I can or cannot offer value and be realistic about that. Where I can offer a lot of value a lot of time is being a trusted support resource in the most difficult moments. I'm always honored when a founder calls me when something is going very wrong or there's some sort of crisis. And if I'm the first call, I know I'm doing my job right because I might not be able to solve the problem, but I am always so honored when that trust is there and I can, at the very least, listen and provide sort of emotional
yeah.
support and coaching through whatever's happening, and in some cases can provide more tangible assistance and connect to the right resources or problem solve accordingly. So I think that's kind of my central measure for how I'm performing as an investor in terms of my portfolio support. And I think it's particularly important for women led companies because there are so few women managers out there and there are so few women CEOs. We're underrepresented overall. And so to find that community of women who have similar lived experiences, never going to be perfect. We're all distinct humans, but I think there's more empathy and more common understanding when you have some of those similar lived experiences. And so that's where I think it's really important to build that community and also increase visibility so we can find one another and easily build those relationships.
Have you seen things change over time? I mean, you've been doing
Yeah.
WXR Fund for a while now. Are things getting better? Are they getting worse? Are they different than they
So
were
the
when you first started?
numbers tell us it's pretty similar. The numbers have been, I mean, there's been little incremental bits of progress here and there, and then there's been backsliding, but more or less, female led companies or exclusively female led have hovered around 2% for the the better part of a decade. So we haven't seen a lot of movement there. However, where I think we have seen a difference is just the awareness and visibility. I mean, there's so much more attention being paid to this, and there's research and there's data and there's really rigorous and robust discussion around it in a meaningful way. And I think more people and more limited partners, investors and venture funds, are paying attention to that. So I think there's a sign of there's hope for change there in the numbers over time. I also anecdotally definitely have experienced a change. I mean, when I started Zealist in 2010, my co-founder and I were both women in our mid-20s and we were completely oblivious to what an anomaly we were. We just were, headstrong and naive. And it took us a long time to find other women in the Seattle startup ecosystem. Years, in fact. I think it was maybe 2 years in before I really started to meet other women founders and CEOs. And these days, I think there's a much better organized ecosystem. So there's more entry points and kind of places where women can come together and share information.
Yeah.
And although the numbers don't really support this, I do feel like there's more of a critical mass. And maybe that is part of just that we're finding each other more easily. But, I think representation on panels, for example, it's pretty rare these days to see an all male panel. And I think those kinds of indicators are leading, and over time we'll see some of the top level measurements start to change more quickly. I hope in my
Yeah.
lifetime our thesis doesn't make sense. That's my ultimate hope.
That's good to hear. You started the show by talking about remote work, and I know that WXR Fund was really, really focused on VR and AR. Are you still pretty bullish on VR and AR? I mean, VR and AR took a pretty big swing during the pandemic and post-pandemic.
So the short answer is I'm still a believer in the technologies, and my thinking has shifted about how I think about the category overall. I When I started my VR studio back in 2017, I was a diehard, fully immersed headset or bust. There was sort of no compromise. And at that time, mobile VR was more of a thing, and there were all of these different, kind of intermediaries that were lower quality. And I have now come to think of it much more as a fluid spectrum of technologies, from mobile AR all the way to fully immersive tethered headsets, and everything in between, as well as the sort of interesting dimension of two-dimensional interfaces like WebXR, and allowing people access and kind of you get a flavor for it without going all in. You can dip your toes in that
Yeah,
way. And so
a little bit more accessible.
yeah, yeah, exactly. As a VR purist in the early days, I undervalued and misunderstood how important accessibility really is. So I've definitely shifted my thinking there, and I'm much less snobby overall about what qualifies or what is superior. Because I
Mhm.
think according to each use case and according to each audience, a different set of tools is going to make sense. And the best companies are adapting to that, and they're adapting quickly, and they're answering their audience's needs, um, and building products that ultimately offer real value. I think that's something that was lost in the early days of VR, is there was a lot of cool tech for cool tech's sake, but at the end of the day wasn't really making anyone's life better or easier. And so I am happy to see, out of necessity, because of capital constraints and a difficult macro environment and a lot of things shifting, there's a real emphasis on fundamentals and offering, really interrogating what is your core value and why does your technology matter at the end of the day. And that discipline and the
Yeah.
kinds of founders that are building in this environment are ultimately going to be a lot more successful. And what I tend to see is they're not leading necessarily with, this is a VR product or this is an AR product. They're leading with, this is a collaboration product and we happen to use some of these 3D tools, or this is a training product and we have an immersive offering. And I think that leading with, what is the core value that you're offering, what is the functionality, and then this is the set of technologies that happen to be powering that, is ultimately more effective.
Remote and virtual collaboration has been on your mind for a long time. How has it changed for you? What are you seeing out there? And talk to me a little bit about remote work and hybrid work and how it relates to the technologies that you're excited about.
I definitely felt like we had a running start at the beginning of the pandemic, because we hosted 3 cohorts of our accelerator in VR, and then many events, community events in VR. And so suddenly everyone was calling us, how do we do this event in VR thing? What does it look like? And we ended up actually collaborating with Verizon on some really cool live event and remote collaboration projects, just to test out different products and kind of push the boundaries on what is possible. This was all through sort of 2020, early 2021 when lockdown was at its height. And I think what we experienced and proved through those set of experiments was that there is a sense of physical presence in VR, and particularly when it comes to live events and kind of feeling the energy of the audience and being able to be on stage and get that immediate feedback that you just really don't get from a 2D interface. There is something special there, and the easiest way I can explain it for those who haven't necessarily been in VR is through that period of time, I was doing a lot of this. I was doing a lot of Zoom calls, as we all were. And more often than not, at the end of the day of back to back Zoom calls, I felt really drained. And even if they were good conversations and people I was excited to see, it was exhausting. Whereas after a VR event, I was jazzed. I felt it, similar to how I would feel. And I'm kind of a ambivert in the middle there, just to give you a sense of my social inclinations. But
Hmm.
after a really great in-person event, I had a similar kind of buzz from a VR event. And I think that is special, and particularly during a time when we couldn't easily access those experiences in person, it was essential. Now, of course, the world is opening up again. Many of us are out and about in person again. And so I think there's less of a imperative for that. And I still think there's a really important place for it, especially in distributed workforces where they're not getting together in person all the time. But I think the forcing function that the pandemic provided has definitely subsided. And we've seen big examples of Altspace VR shutting down, Microsoft cutting that. That was where we hosted a lot of our events. It was very sad that that product was ultimately shelved and a lot of companies divesting from the space and a lot of companies having a harder time getting funded. So I think we will get to a place where we have very specific, discrete use cases where it still makes a lot of sense and it's still a superior way to interact. But as long as we are able to get together in person somewhat easily, I don't think there's going to necessarily in the near term be that sort of scale that we saw at the height of the pandemic when people didn't have other options.
How is Goldenrod different than the WXR fund in terms of your thesis?
So Goldenrod is really an expansion of a lot of the thinking with WXR and applying some of the learnings. I think WXR, it was the right fund for a specific moment in time where the industry was very nascent and the boundaries around AR and VR and or XR, that term didn't really catch on for a lot of folks, but obviously we latched onto it with our fund name, were clearer. And I think there was a very tightly knit community at that time. It's now grown. And what I see is that more companies are sort of sorting according to industry and vertical versus specific XR pockets necessarily. And it's also, like I said, kind of integrated into this broader tool set. It's not necessarily standalone or distinct in the way that it was in the early days. And so the Goldenrod thesis is looking at the digital and physical integration of our experiences, relationships, and identities more broadly. So really examining the increased intimacy and pervasiveness of technology in our everyday lives, which obviously XR is a huge part of, as well as some other tools. And because that is a broader kind of technical thesis, we're bringing in thematic discipline around climate, health, media, and community. So those will be our core themes that we're focused on.
So say that one more time: climate, health, media,
And community.
and community. Yeah, that's really interesting. So as you think about in your mentoring of founders and this kind of investing thesis, how are you talking to your founders about remote work, about hybrid work, about getting back together again? Starting a company is really hard. And being able to communicate and be in tight quarters was always something that was really valued. Now that's changing a lot for remote first companies. I wonder how you think about that. What are you talking to your founders about?
Yeah, I had this conversation a lot, and I would say it's almost 50-50 where my founders fall in terms of whether they're very adamant about getting back to the office and having that shared physical space, or they're really excited about the possibilities a remote workforce opens up, especially in terms of recruitment and the kinds of talent they can access. So it's really pretty evenly split. And I think some of that comes down to the specific objectives a company is trying to accomplish and the scale that they're at. So, for example, I think supporting a remote workforce in fewer than 20 employees is a lot easier than when you get over 100 or close to 500 or what. As you get to a certain scale, there are more and more challenges that come up with that. However, I also think it depends on how the CEO and executive team is thinking about supporting that culture and investing in informal communication cadence and simulating some of those water cooler conversations that happen. And I think the best example of this from our portfolio is a company called Tangle. That actually started. This is kind of a fun startup story too. They started as a gaming studio and pivoted to this remote collaboration product during the pandemic, or maybe right before the pandemic, because they built it for themselves. And because they're a gaming studio, it's really fun and playful. But the idea is that this product supports all of those kind of spontaneous interactions that happen if you were at a physical office together and you could walk by and say, "Hey Boaz, did you see
Huh.
the game yesterday? And by the way, how's this project going?" And those kinds of conversations that can end up being so important to a healthy culture, and also produce tangible results in terms of the projects folks are working on. So they've built this really fun, playful product to support that, and it's working out really well. Sorry if you can hear a little barking in the background for their customers. It'll be interesting to see as it scales. But I think that's the biggest question with a lot of this, is the scalability of the solutions that are in the marketplace or being developed, as well as just the kind of strategy that's underpinning how those products are used and deployed within a given company. And I think it's possible to do it really well, but it is not easy. And I think it ultimately comes down to how the CEO sort of prioritizes different aspects of workforce management and where they want to put their energy.
I've talked to a lot of founders that are thinking about it in a very fluid hybrid way where
Mhm.
certain kinds of activities can get taken care of with different kinds of virtual tools. Then, key strategic moments, they meet together and have conversations on sites, off sites, however you want to call it. And that seems like I've been hearing that a lot lately.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And I think the other piece of this conversation that I'm sure others have brought up is the social equity piece, and that there's a lot of data that shows now that for women and caregivers in particular, flexible work or remote work is a very appealing option. And that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But I think if you're an employer who's prioritizing DEI and thinking about how you can access underutilized talent, it's a really great option to consider.
Yeah. Going back to the conversation at the beginning about mentorship and you talking to founders and really liking to be that trusted advisor in the first call, who was somebody like that for you?
So I was really lucky over the last year to participate in a program called Journey to Lead. I was a fellow, and they have a group of women who participate in the program called Champions. And there were a few champions in particular who really meant a lot to me in terms of catalyzing my career and the way I was thinking about things. And one is Jenny Abramson from Rethink Capital. So Rethink is the largest fund focused on women-led companies out there. So she's really kind of exemplary of the sort of growth I would like to see in my own career. And a couple of others are Jenny Just and Margot Georgiadis. Both of them, they've built businesses. They've been wildly successful in a variety of domains. And then I would say with all three, they have what I at least perceive to be really healthy personal lives and families, and some semblance of balance in their lives. And with all of them, I've had these in-depth conversations of, sort of how did you do it, both logistically and emotionally and spiritually, and just all of the things. They've given me great practical tips and wisdom around that. But I think more than anything, the modeling that they've done and just seeing that it's possible, and seeing they're a few years and steps ahead of me, and have achieved a lot of the sorts of things I want to achieve, and also have stayed grounded, wonderful human beings with healthy relationships. I think especially for women, it feels like there's an impossible tension there a lot of times. And so to see that that is possible, and to get to know women who really embody that, has been very powerful for me.
It's great to hear that that kind of support is so necessary as a founder, but also in whatever career that you're in. I think a lot of people have communicated to me that work and workplace is different now than it was pre pandemic, and that mentorship and management and feeling like there's that kind of support has really been lacking, especially for young people. And so I like to hear stories about that, how you are feeling supported and mentored along the way.
Yeah, and we did get together for what it's worth. We had several in-person gatherings for that program as well as virtual, and the in-person cadence of it was really important to developing those relationships. So I don't think we should ever lose sight of that, whether we're talking about the workplace or mentorship programs
Yeah.
or whatever the realm.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. I spend a lot of time thinking about productivity and productivity hacks
Mhm.
and how work is changing in that way as well. Are there companies that you're seeing right now that really support this future of work as it relates to productivity and technologies that you're excited about?
I mean, the obvious one, the elephant in the room, is everything that ChatGPT is unlocking. And I think that in the ways every day now, my feeds are populated with different ways of utilizing it. And I think that's great. I think it's really, really great and exciting. It's also a lot of noise to sift through. And so, from an investment perspective, it's tricky to kind of decide what's real and what's just sort of smoke and mirrors at this point, and what will be the lasting implication of that. And the way I have shifted my thinking a bit in this regard is kind of emphasizing efficiency a little less and thinking more about efficacy, and where some of these tools can, and sure, efficiency is part of that equation, because ultimately you do want to save time. But I think we've spent so much time collectively emphasizing efficiency, and we're pretty darn efficient at this point, but we're not always effective. And I think the ways that ChatGPT can be utilized is actually a great example of that, because you can have it write whatever post or content you want, but if you're not using the right prompts, or if you're not, and if you don't have the right lens to edit and iterate on that,
Yeah.
it's not ultimately going to be an effective output. And so that's how I'm evaluating a lot of these technologies that I'm looking at these days. Is everyone is saying that they can improve efficiency, and they probably can, but is the solution really effective? And are the guardrails, I mean, with a lot of this, it comes down to two things really: the learning data and how those outputs are being generated, and the guardrails around it, and the way that you're guiding the user and keeping the system within certain bounds, such that it doesn't become nonsensical or get into some really weird territory. And that's just so important in any product design, but it also really helps me to quickly triage some of these things as I'm going through, multiple opportunities a day that are all kind of advertising the most efficient, most life-changing solution of all time.
That's a good way to think about it. I know that you're probably looking at teams really closely also as a way of filtering all the action that's coming your way, which I assume that there's a lot of AI pitches that are happening right now, getting put on your table. Effectiveness is an interesting way to think about it. I mean, so much can be altered in terms of the response that you're getting based on prompts
Mhm.
and based on prompt engineering.
Mhm.
And so strategy becomes a huge part of the puzzle.
Yeah, it really does. And I think the sales enablement is a big category for there's, and this is not new with ChatGPT, but there's been tons of optimization there for many, many years now. But ultimately, there's still a similar sort of breakdown in top performers and everyone else from us in most companies' sales function. And the products that are going to be most transformative over the next few years are products that can not only sort of optimize everyone's calendars and the way that they're spending each minute of the day, but can unlock the potential in some of these groups that have previously maybe not been those top performers, or previously not been able to rise above a certain threshold, whether that's sales or any other function. There's a lot of interesting things happening in coaching. There's a lot of leadership development principles here that can be applied at scale with some of the AI tools that now exist.
Yeah. What are some of the productivity things that you do with your work? I know not necessarily digital, but just a lot of people have different kinds of things they use during the day to create more focus. Sometimes there's people who meditate, sometimes there's different ways that they approach email. Do you have any productivity hacks that you do that you can share?
Yeah, a lot of what I've learned about being more productive over time is counterintuitive, in that I spend less time working. And what I mean by that, in the sense of being busy, I think there's this cultural imperative to be busy, and that busy equates with productivity. And I have learned over time that is not the case for me, at least. And in some cases, there's actually an inverse relationship there. And so I do mini meditations throughout the day. I did one not long before this conversation. I would love to say I'm the kind of person who can sit and meditate for a solid half hour or more. I'm not. I usually do a 5 minute meditation, but it's a nice sort of reset. And sometimes, honestly, even though it's 5 minutes, it's difficult for me to peel myself away from email and the various other things on my to-do list to carve out that time. Something I do almost every day is take about a 3 or 4 mile walk at some point in the day. Sometimes I do it while I'm on a call, so it's not necessarily completely taking time away from work, but getting outside, getting that movement in. When I get back from those walks is usually my most creative and productive hour or two of the day. So there's a really, really clear ROI there in spending that time out in nature, in fresh air, moving around. Two of my main ones that actually involve not working, and the other piece of that that's sort of thematically aligned is I say no to a lot more things, a lot more. And becoming a mother made me more ruthless about this. And I think the hardest thing is I say no to interesting and good things. There's the principle of essentialism that aspiring to greatness isn't about saying no to bad things and yes to good things. It's about saying no to two good things because you know something great is waiting. And I've really tried to adopt that principle in the way that I prioritize the way I spend my time.
I love those. Those are great. I really appreciate you saying yes to being on this show. And it's been wonderful talking with you. And so I like to end with a question that I ask everybody. Can you describe the future of work in 2 words or less?
Well, I love alliteration. So I'm going to go with flexible and fluid. And, we talked about this a little bit already. I think the flexibility piece is pretty clear. And the fluidity piece, I think, has been a long time in the making as well. But none of us are going to have one career anymore. And I think being able to adapt, being able to see the writing on the wall and change course and learn quickly is going to be probably the most critical key to success in professional trajectories. So I think that fluidity is just something that is going to increase in pace and importance over time.
Awesome. Martina, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I've always really looked up to you, and I think that you're doing great things for the startup community. I'm really excited about Goldenrod and what you have in store. So thanks again for being on
Thank
the
you,
show.
Boaz. Great to see you.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. What a pleasure to have Martina Welkhoff as our guest in today's episode. Martina's passion for female founders and entrepreneurship in general is clear, and it was great to hear about some of the companies and new technologies she is looking at. If you want to learn more about Martina and her work, you can find her on LinkedIn and Twitter, and also at goldenrod.vc. If you are raising money for your company, you should definitely connect with her and keep up with her posts and activity. I continue to be amazed by the guests we've had on the show, and I'm excited about the ones joining in the near future. I truly appreciate you spending your time with us. Thank you for listening to the episode. Don't forget to follow us for more exciting interviews about the future of the workplace.